The train groaned as it slowed, iron wheels screeching over the tracks, the whistle splitting the thin mountain air with a sound that seemed half mournful cry and half warning. Steam hissed and billowed around the wooden platform like fog creeping in from the forest, and Clara Barrett stepped down from the carriage with a hesitant foot, her carpetbag bumping against her leg. Her breath came in white puffs, her fingers stiff from gripping the handle for hours. She was 30 miles from the nearest real town, in a place whose name was so new and so forgotten that it wasn't written on most maps. The station itself was a lean structure, wood gray with weather, the paint long since peeled by wind and snow. She had expected something rough, but not this empty, not this quiet. Her boots tapped against the planks and she looked up, searching the small crowd for a man she had only known through letters. Henry Barrett. The name had grown so familiar she could whisper it to herself in the dark and feel steadied. He was meant to be waiting here with a horse and wagon, perhaps a new coat for her, and the warm smile he had described in neat script across 6 letters mailed over the last year. She had pictured the moment so many times on the journey west, his hand reaching for hers, strong enough to reassure her that she had made the right choice. But no hand reached. No smile greeted her. Instead, a pair of ranch hands leaned against the post at the end of the platform, their hats tipped low, eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin prickle. A boy no older than 16 pushed a handcart of grain sacks, pausing only to glance at her curiously before disappearing down the track. The station master, a squat man with wind-chafed cheeks, narrowed his eyes at her and then at the ticket still clutched in her hand. "Waiting on someone, miss?" he asked, his voice flat as stone. "Mr. Henry Barrett," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He sent for me." The man scratched his chin, spitting into the dirt before answering. "Ain't no Barretts in these parts. Not that I ever heard." Her heart dropped with the words. For a moment she simply stood there, carpetbag hanging heavy from her hand, the station fading into a blur of steam and voices. She thought of the farmhouse she had left behind in Ohio, the family who had sold a milk cow just to pay her passage. She thought of her mother's trembling hands fastening the last button on her traveling coat, of her father's solemn blessing. She had carried all their hope, their belief that she might carve out a better life in the West. But here at the edge of nowhere, that hope threatened to collapse beneath the weight of silence. A gust of wind cut through the platform, carrying with it the scent of pine, smoke, and something wilder, an untamed sharpness she could not name. The ranch hands chuckled at something she could not hear, and one of them took a step forward, thumb hooked in his belt. Clara's chest tightened. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, clutching the fabric as though it might shield her from more than just the cold. Out beyond the station, where the forest pressed close to the clearing, a man watched. He stood apart, half-shadowed beneath the pines, his shoulders broad beneath a weathered coat of buckskin, his hair long and threaded with gray, though his face was not yet old. His eyes were dark, restless, carrying the weight of years alone in the wilderness. Some in town whispered that he was dangerous, others that he was broken. Yet all agreed he was not a man to be trifled with. He had not meant to linger at the station. He had come for supplies, nothing more. But when he saw the woman step off the train, small and fragile and carrying that worn carpetbag like it contained her very soul, something stirred in him, he thought, long buried. Memory flickered. A cabin fire. A woman's laughter that no longer filled his nights. A child's face that haunted his dreams. He clenched his hands, scarred from old battles with beast and man alike, and for a moment considered turning away. Then he saw the ranch hand move closer to her. Clara's carpetbag slipped from her numb fingers, thudding onto the platform. She bent quickly to grab it, but the man was already there, reaching for the handle with a grin that made her stomach twist. "Let me help you, miss," he drawled. She shook her head, her voice catching. "No, thank you, The mountain man stepped from the shadows, his boots heavy on the earth, his presence enough to draw eyes away from the trembling woman. His voice was low, carrying the weight of command without needing to rise. She said no. The ranch hand straightened, surprise flashing into irritation, then into caution as he recognized the stranger. Whispers traveled fast in places like this, and everyone knew better than to test the man who had once killed 3 outlaws in the canyon, with nothing but his rifle and his knife. The ranch hand muttered something under his breath and stepped back. Clara looked up at her unexpected defender, her heart pounding. He was not the man she had expected to meet, nor did he carry the warmth she had been promised in letters. But in his eyes there was something steady, something fierce that anchored her for the first time since the train had left Ohio. She did not yet know his name, nor the shadows that clung to his past. She only knew that she had been abandoned on the edge of a merciless wilderness, and that this scarred stranger might be the only barrier between her and the ruin that waited in every shadow. And so began Clara Barrett's story in the Wild West. A story not of letters and promises, but of survival, choices, and the fragile thread of hope that might yet bind two broken lives together. The ranch hand muttered as he stepped back, his boots grinding against the frozen planks. Clara clutched her carpetbag to her chest, her breath short, her fingers stiff with cold and fear. The mountain man, silent, broad, steady, did not look at her right away. His gaze lingered on the ranch hand until the man and his companion drifted away with a sneer. Muttering curses they did not dare let him hear clearly. Only then did the stranger's eyes settle on Clara, dark and storm-worn, searching her face as though weighing something far heavier than the moment. "You're not meant to be here alone," he said at last, his voice low, roughened by years of wind and smoke. It was not an accusation nor exactly kindness. It was a statement of fact, spoken like a man who had seen what happened to those who were. Clara swallowed, trying to summon strength in a throat gone dry. "My husband. He was supposed to meet me here." The words broke apart as soon as they left her lips, fragile as icicles in sunlight. The man said nothing. Silence stretched, filled only by the rattle of a wagon rolling past and the distant call of a crow. Clara felt heat creep into her face, shame pressing down on her shoulders. It was foolish, perhaps, to speak so openly to a stranger. Yet what choice did she have? The station master was shutting the ticket window, his indifference plain. The crowd had thinned. The platform felt emptier now, lonelier. The train had gone, leaving only the hiss of cooling iron and the echo of its departure. Clara realized with a jolt that she truly had nowhere to go, nowhere to sleep that night. No husband waiting, no family within 1,000 miles. Her knees weakened and she lowered her bag to the ground, resting her hands against its worn leather as if anchoring herself. She whispered almost to herself, "He promised me a home." The stranger's jaw tightened. He looked away toward the mountains rising beyond the station, their slopes cloaked in pines, their peaks crowned with snow. He had once made promises too. He had once believed in the weight of words carried across distance, and he had once watched those promises burn away in fire and blood. He could have turned and left her. He had done so with others before. A woman abandoned was not a rare sight on the frontier. Too many came west on letters and faith, only to find empty stations and empty nights. Most learned quickly that the land offered no mercy. He had told himself long ago that he was done carrying the burdens of strangers. But as the wind whipped across the platform, tugging at her shawl and scattering dust around her boots, he saw her eyes lift again. Blue, wide, filled with a desperate courage that fought against despair. Something in him shifted against his will. "There's no Barrett out here," he said, finally giving her the truth in plain words. "If you were sent for, you were lied to. Or he's dead." The word struck like a blow, though she had already suspected it. Clara pressed her lips together, refusing to let her tears show. She could not break here. She could not collapse in front of this stranger, no matter how steady his presence seemed. "I'll manage," she said, though her voice trembled. "I always do." The mountain man studied her. She was slender, with no more than a shawl and carpetbag between her and the vastness of Montana territory. She had no kin, no wagon, no weapon. And still she said she would manage. For a moment, despite himself, he admired her stubbornness. But stubbornness alone did not keep wolves from tearing at a cabin door. He stooped and picked up her carpetbag, ignoring her startled protest. "There's a boarding house down in town. Mrs. Ryan runs it. She'll give you a bed for the night." Clara hesitated. The thought of following a stranger, especially one so imposing, was dangerous. But the alternative was wandering alone through streets she had never seen, with men already watching her like vultures circling. She gathered her shawl tighter and nodded. The two of them walked through the thin settlement, their footsteps crunching on the hard ground. Cabins leaned against each other like weary men. Smoke rose from chimneys sharp with pine. Dogs barked from alleyways. Children darted past, pausing to gape at Clara's eastern dress and at the man beside her. He said little, and she found she had no words to fill the silence, but in her mind questions stirred. Who was he? Why had those ranch hands feared him? Why had he helped her when others had looked away? The boarding house stood near the center of town, a two-story building with lace curtains hanging limp in the window. Mrs. Ryan, a plump Irish widow with kind eyes and a sharp tongue, greeted them at the door. Her gaze flicked from Clara to the stranger and back again, reading more than Clara wished revealed. "Room upstairs," Mrs. Ryan said, bustling. "I'll have stew on soon. You'll need it. Looks like you've traveled far." The stranger set the carpet bag down just inside the door. "She needs watching," he said, his tone not asking, but commanding. Then, with a tip of his hat, he turned to leave. Clara startled, reaching out before she could stop herself. "Wait," her voice cracked. "I don't even know your name." He paused at the threshold, shadows cutting across his face. After a long moment, he said, "Wyatt." And then he was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk like smoke carried by the wind. Clara stood in the small boarding house, her heart torn between gratitude, fear, and an ache she could not yet name. She had been abandoned, and yet not entirely alone. She had come west seeking a husband, a home, a future written in neat letters. Instead, she had found only danger, uncertainty, and a mountain man whose name lingered on her lips like a secret. As night fell over the town, Clara lay awake in the narrow bed upstairs, listening to the creak of the building and the distant howl of wolves from the mountains. She wondered if she had stepped into her ending, or the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more alive than she had ever dreamed. The night at Mrs. Ryan's boarding house was long and restless. Clara lay in the narrow bed beneath, a quilt that smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, staring at the shadows thrown by the lamp on the wall. Every creak of the old building, every footstep on the floorboards below made her heart beat faster. She was not a child anymore, yet she had never known loneliness like this. The kind that pressed in from every direction until she felt as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. Testing her strength, she turned over and pressed her face into the pillow. She had told Wyatt she would manage. She had wanted to believe it, but in truth she did not know how. The land outside the window was not her home, not the soft hills of Ohio with their familiar fences and well-worn paths. Here the world stretched raw and endless, filled with eyes. Men's eyes, wolves' eyes, the watchful gaze of mountains that had stood for centuries. She was a stranger in all of it, and her only tether was the memory of a scarred man who had stepped out of the trees like some ghost from the wilderness. Morning came slow and pale. A frost glazed the edges of the glass, and Clara shivered as she dressed. Mrs. Ryan was already bustling about the kitchen, ladling out bowls of porridge to the other boarders, traveling merchants, a young preacher, with a cough, and a miner who smelled of whiskey even before the sun had risen. Clara ate quietly, listening to the murmur of voices, trying not to draw attention. Yet attention found her all the same. Men looked, some curious, some hungry. She felt their stares prickle against her skin and lowered her eyes, gripping her spoon until her knuckles whitened. Mrs. Ryan noticed. She clucked her tongue and leaned close, whispering, "Don't let them rattle you, dear. Men out here ain't had softness in their lives for years. They'll stare at anything that reminds them of home. Just keep your chin up." Clara nodded, though her chin felt heavy. After breakfast, she wandered into the street, the cold air sharper than knives. The town was waking, wagons creaking, horses snorting, hammers ringing from the blacksmith's shop. Life pulsed around her, yet she walked through it like a ghost, untethered. Her husband, no, her supposed husband, was gone, a phantom of ink and lies. She had nowhere to go, no plan, no anchor. Then she saw him again. Wyatt stood outside the general store, a sack of flour slung over one shoulder. His presence was as solid as the mountains behind him, drawing the gaze of passers-by who gave him a wide berth. Clara hesitated, her heart stumbling. Part of her wanted to turn away, to hide, for she felt fragile under his storm-dark eyes. Another part of her ached for the strange steadiness he carried, as if he had carved it out of the wilderness itself. He saw her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he shifted the sack on his shoulder and said, "You'll need supplies." Clara blinked. Supplies? If you plan to stay. Food, clothes fit for the winter here. Boots. His gaze flicked to her shoes, Thin-soled, better suited to city streets than mountain passes. Those won't last a week. She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, part embarrassment, part gratitude. I don't know if I'm staying. You've got no choice, he said bluntly. You can't go back. Not unless you've got money for the fare, and I doubt you do. His words struck sharp, not untrue, but harsh all the same. Clara lifted her chin, refusing to let him see the crack in her resolve. Then I'll find work. I can sew, I can read, I can keep a house. Wyatt studied her, the ghost of something unreadable passing across his face. Work out here's not the kind you're used to. He set the sack down on the wagon hitched nearby. But maybe... He trailed off, as though arguing with himself. Before Clara could press him, a shout split the street. Two men burst out of the saloon, fists flying, curses thick in the air. One of them stumbled into the road, colliding with Clara and nearly knocking her off her feet. She gasped, stumbling back only to feel Wyatt's hand catch her elbow, steadying her. His grip was firm, grounding, pulling her close just long enough for her to find balance again. The brawl spilled into the street, boots thudding, fists cracking against bone. The sheriff, a tall man with a badge tarnished by dust, strode out with his rifle in hand, barking orders until the men scattered. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. She clutched her shawl around her and realized with a shiver that this place was not just lonely. It was dangerous. Wyatt released her slowly, his eyes still on the men disappearing down the road. You see now, he said quietly. This land doesn't forgive the weak. Clara drew in a shaky breath, her heart pounding. And what am I then? She whispered. Wyatt's gaze turned back to her, lingering for a long moment. Someone who's got a choice to make, he said. Then he picked up the sack of flour and walked away, leaving her standing in the churned dust of the street, her question still burning in the cold morning air. That night, Clara returned to the boarding house with her mind restless, her thoughts circling like wolves around a fire. The West was testing her already. She had been promised safety and found none. She had been promised love and found only lies. But now she had found something else, something far more dangerous, the beginning of a bond with a man who carried his past in silence, and who might be the only shield she had against the merciless wild, and far out in the mountains, unseen by either of them. Men gathered around another fire, speaking names and grudges, and one of those names, Wyatt's, was spoken with hatred. The days that followed unfolded like a test Clara had not prepared for. She tried to stay invisible within the boarding house, but invisibility was impossible in a town where every stranger was accounted for, and every glance lingered too long. Word spread quickly. A woman had arrived alone, with no husband, no family, no protection. Curiosity gave way to gossip, gossip to whispers, and whispers to something sharper, something hungry. Mrs. Ryan did her best to shield her. Don't go wandering after dusk, she warned one evening, pressing a ladle of stew into Clara's hands. And don't you speak to every man that tips his hat. Kindness is rare out here, but trouble isn't. Clara nodded, grateful, yet her gratitude was laced with unease. She knew she could not stay in this house forever. A woman alone was never meant to linger in limbo. She was either claimed by a family, a husband, or by ruin. Wyatt's name rose often in conversation, sometimes spoken with grudging respect, sometimes with wariness. Clara listened carefully, piecing together fragments of who he was. A man who had once trapped furs in the mountains, who had lived through winters so bitter they carved lines into his face. A man who had killed outlaws in a canyon fight that still echoed in saloon tales. And yet a man who wanted nothing from anyone, who vanished into the wilderness whenever people came too close. Still, he did not vanish entirely from Clara's days. She saw him again outside the blacksmith's shop, and again when he carried supplies toward the edge of town. Always brief encounters, always few words. Yet each time, she felt that strange steadiness in him, the kind of steadiness born from surviving things most men never could. One afternoon, as snow began to fall in thin, drifting flakes, Clara stepped into the general store to buy a spool of thread with the last coin she had carried west. Her hands shook slightly as she counted them on the counter, aware of the storekeeper's assessing gaze. Behind her, voices rose, two men, their tones sharp, laced with anger. "He thinks he can hide up in those mountains forever." One spat. "But we ain't forgotten what he did. Wyatt's time is comin'," the other growled. "Mark my words." Clara froze, her fingers tightening around the small purchase. She did not turn, but their words seared into her mind. Hatred. Revenge. Wyatt's name carried it like a curse. Outside, the snow thickened, coating the street in pale silence. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, hurrying back toward the boarding house, but she could not shake the echo of those voices. Wyatt was not merely a loner, not merely a mountain man with scars. He was a man hunted. That evening she found him again, not by chance, but by choice. He was near the edge of town, loading sacks onto a mule, preparing to head back into the wilderness. Clara's steps crunched in the snow as she approached, her heart hammering with fear and defiance. "You didn't tell me," she said, her voice trembling, "that there are men who want you dead." Wyatt stilled, his back to her. For a moment she thought he might ignore her altogether. But then he straightened, turning slowly. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not surprise but resignation. "Everyone out here's got enemies," he said, voice low, some louder than others. "They spoke your name," Clara pressed. "In the store. They hate you. Why?" He studied her for a long time, snow gathering on his shoulders, melting into the worn fabric of his coat. When he spoke, it was with the weight of a man unaccustomed to sharing truth. "Because I didn't bow when they told me to. Because I stood when they wanted me on my knees. And because I killed men who would have burned every home in this valley." The words chilled her as deeply as the snow itself, yet there was no boast in his tone, only weariness. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to recoil, to guard herself, yet something in his gaze held her steady. Not cruelty, but sorrow. "Then they'll come again," she whispered. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Yes, they will." A silence hung between them, heavy as the falling snow. Clara's hands trembled at her sides, not only from fear but from the sudden raw awareness that her fate was already entwining with his. She had not chosen it, and yet here it was, woven into the very air, into every step she took on this unforgiving land. "If you stay in town," Wyatt said at last, "they'll use you. They'll see you're alone, and they'll use that against you. If you come with me into the mountains, you'll face the cold, the hunger, and worse, but at least you'll know where danger's coming from." Clara's heart thudded. He was not offering safety. He was offering truth. She thought of the letters she had once cherished, filled with promises of comfort and belonging, lies written in ink. And now here was Wyatt with no promises, only stark honesty carved from hardship. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Then I'll go with you." Wyatt searched her face for a long time, as if testing the steel beneath her words. Then with a slow nod, he handed her the reins of the mule. "You'll regret it," he muttered. But in his eyes she caught the flicker of something else, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. As the two of them set out toward the snow-draped mountains, the town watched from behind shuttered windows. Some whispered, some scoffed, but others only shook their heads, for they knew that the wilderness swallowed the unprepared, and no woman fresh off a train had ever lasted long in the shadows of the northern pines. Yet Clara walked beside Wyatt anyway, her breath rising in white clouds, her shawl pulled close, her every step carrying her deeper into a fate no longer her own. The trail into the mountains was no gentle path. Snow fell thicker as the day wore on, muffling sound swallowing the world in a cold silence that pressed against Clara's ears. She trudged beside the mule, her skirts damp from the drifts, her fingers stiff despite the shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. Each breath burned her lungs, yet she forced herself to keep pace with Wyatt, whose steps were steady and sure, as if the wilderness itself bent beneath his will. By dusk, the trees had closed around them, towering pines whose limbs groaned beneath the weight of snow. The air smelled sharp, resin and ice mingling, and the world was painted in shades of gray. Clara's body ached, her legs trembling, but she bit her lip to keep from complaining. She had chosen this. She had told herself she would not falter. Wyatt halted at last near a clearing where a frozen creek cut a silver line through the forest. With practiced movements, he unloaded the mule and began setting a small camp. His hands scarred yet deft. He spoke little, though once he glanced at Clara, reading the exhaustion etched into her features. "Sit," he said gruffly, tossing her a rolled blanket. "You'll freeze if you don't rest." She obeyed, sinking onto the log he dragged near the fire pit. Her body sagged with relief as flames crackled to life. their light casting long shadows that danced among the trees. Warmth seeped slowly into her bones, but fear lingered, whispering that she was far from the world she knew, surrounded by nothing but darkness and the sharp edge of survival. Wyatt cooked with silence, a tin pot of beans and strips of dried meat simmering over the fire. Clara watched him, noting how every movement carried the weight of habit, how his eyes flicked often to the trees as if expecting danger at any moment. Finally, when the food was ready, he handed her a tin cup and sat across from her. The firelight carved the lines of his face, accentuating the hollows beneath his eyes, the scars at the edge of his jaw. "You'll learn fast out here," he said quietly, "or you won't last." Clara swallowed a mouthful of beans, their smoky taste both foreign and grounding. "And you? How have you lasted this long?" For the first time, Wyatt's gaze softened, just for a heartbeat. "By losing more than I ever thought I could bear." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken stories. Clara felt her chest tighten. She wanted to ask, wanted to peel back the silence that clung to him, but something in his eyes warned her away. Instead, she drew her blanket tighter, staring into the fire as snow drifted like ash from the sky. That night, sleep came in fitful fragments. The forest was alive with sounds. Branches cracking under ice, the distant howl of wolves threading through the trees. Clara lay on the ground, wrapped in the blanket, the cold seeping up from the earth despite the fire. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the station platform again. The moment she had realized she'd been abandoned, and now here she was, further from safety than ever, tethered to a man whose past drew enemies like wolves to blood. Near dawn, a sound jolted her awake. Not the forest, but Wyatt's voice, low and tense. He was crouched near the edge of camp, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. Clara's heart hammered as she scrambled up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "What is it?" she whispered. He lifted a hand, silencing her. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then crack, a branch snapped in the trees. Another. Heavy footsteps circling just beyond the glow of the fire. Clara's breath caught, every muscle in her body taut. Wyatt rose, his frame looming, rifle steady. "Men," he murmured. Not wolves. Fear knifed through her. The voices she had heard in the store came rushing back. Those men vowing revenge, speaking Wyatt's name with hatred. And now, in the dead of night, they had found them. From the shadows, a laugh rang out, cruel and cold. "Wyatt," a voice called. "You thought you could run forever, but the mountains won't hide you tonight." Clara's stomach dropped. She gripped the blanket tighter, her eyes darting to Wyatt, who stood unflinching, his silhouette etched against the firelight. His voice was steady like stone. "Then come and try." The forest erupted with movement, men stepping from the dark, rifles gleaming, eyes burning with vengeance. Clara's world shrank to the fire, the snow, and the inevitability of blood about to be spilled. And in that moment, as fear wrapped around her throat, she realized something fierce. Whatever Wyatt's past held, whatever sins or sacrifices had carved him into the man he was, her survival now depended on him, and perhaps his survival against all odds might depend on her too. The fire crackled low, embers glowing against the snow as the men closed in from the trees. Clara's breath came fast, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, the cold biting her skin. Her eyes darted from the rifle in Wyatt's steady hands to the shadowed figures circling them, their boots crunching over frost. The leader stepped forward, a broad man with a scar cutting across his cheek, his voice dripping with venom. "You should have stayed gone, Wyatt. You took from us, and now we'll take everything from you." Wyatt didn't flinch. His stance was a wall of calm, but Clara saw the tension in his jaw, the scars on his knuckles, the weight of years behind his silence. "I took nothing that wasn't already paid for in blood," he said. A harsh laugh tore from the man's throat. Rifles lifted. Clara's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break free. She wanted to run, to hide, yet her legs would not move. Then it began. The crack of rifles split the night, fire bursting from muzzles, smoke curling through the frozen air. Wyatt's rifle answered sharp and fast, each shot measured, deliberate. He moved with the precision of a man who had lived too long with death at his back. Clara dropped low behind the mule's pack, clutching the frozen ground as bullets tore through branches above her. Screams broke out. One man fell, another cursed, clutching his arm, but more pressed in. Wyatt fought with fury, his eyes dark as storm clouds, his body turning, firing, reloading with movements born of muscle and memory. Clara's terror surged until it threatened to crush her. But then something inside her snapped. She could not simply cower while the world burned around her. Her hand darted to the mule's packs, fumbling until she found a small hatchet wedged near the firewood. She gripped it with trembling fingers, her knuckles white, and forced herself upright. One of the raiders broke from the trees, charging for the camp with a snarl. Clara's heart stuttered, but she lifted the hatchet, stepping between the man and the fire. Fear seared her throat, but she swung, her arms guided not by strength but by desperation. The blade glanced off his shoulder enough to make him stumble. Wyatt's rifle cracked an instant later, and the man fell into the snow, lifeless. Clara gasped, the weight of what she had done slamming into her chest. Her body shook, but Wyatt's eyes flicked to hers just for a heartbeat. And in them she saw not shock but recognition. He had seen the fire within her, the refusal to break. The battle raged on, the night alive with smoke, cries, the reek of powder. Clara clung to the firelight, each second an eternity, until at last the forest grew silent once more. The remaining men fled, their curses trailing into the dark, leaving bodies in the snow and blood steaming against the cold. Wyatt stood breathing hard, rifle still in hand, his coat torn, blood streaking his temple. Clara rushed to him, her hands hovering, afraid to touch but unable to stay still. "Are you—" "I'm fine," he cut in, though his voice was ragged. "You're bleeding," she whispered. His gaze softened, the hardness fading for the first time since she had met him. "Better me than you." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, she reached for his arm, steadying him as the firelight flickered between them. Silence returned, thick and heavy. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground, covering the bodies, covering the violence that had nearly claimed them both. They sat together by the dying fire, the night vast around them. Wyatt's shoulders slumped, the weight of old ghosts settling again. Clara watched him, her heart pounding with something she had not expected to feel. Something dangerous, something alive. At last he spoke, his voice low, almost broken. "I told myself I'd never bring another soul into this life. Not after what I lost." He stared into the flames, eyes haunted. "My wife, my boy, gone because of men like them. Because I thought I could fight and still keep them safe." Clara's chest ached. She reached for his scarred hand, resting her smaller one against it. He flinched at the touch, then slowly let himself breathe. "Wyatt," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "You can't fight the past, but you don't have to fight the future alone." Their eyes met, the fire reflecting between them, and for the first time, she saw the wall within him crack. Not gone, not yet, but broken enough to let her in. Dawn crept slowly, pale light spilling over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold. Clara stood beside Wyatt, her hand in his, the world vast and merciless before them. She had come west seeking a husband promised in letters, and instead she had found a man carved from wilderness and grief, a man she did not fully know, yet one whose presence had become the anchor keeping her from drifting into despair. No husband, no help, just her in the Wild West, and perhaps if fate allowed him, for in the mountains survival was never promised. But together they had carved out a chance-ending line, the end. For now.